Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Sexual Hegemony virtual book launch panel and Q&A with our panelists, Max Fox, who is the editor of this volume by Christopher Chitty, also Christopher Nealon, who wrote the introduction, and Tobi Haslett, who is a wonderful writer who's going to be joining us for this conversation. I work in marketing at Duke University Press, and I'm just taking a moment to introduce the book. In Sexual Hegemony, Christopher Chitty traces the 500-year history of capitalist sexual relations by excavating the class dynamics of the bourgeoisie's attempts to regulate homosexuality, tracking the politicization of male homosexuality in Renaissance Florence, Amsterdam, Paris, and London between the 17th and 19th centuries, as well as 20th century New York City. Chitty shows how sexuality became a crucial dimension of the accumulation of capital and a technique of bourgeois rule, whether policing male sodomy during the Medici rule in Florence, or accusing the French aristocracy of monstrous sexuality in the wake of the French Revolution. The bourgeoisie weaponized both sexual constraint and sexual freedom in order to produce and control a reliable and regimented labor class and subordinate it to civil society and the state. Only by grasping sexuality as a field of social contention and the site of class conflict, Chitty contends, can we embark on a politics that destroys sexuality as a tool and an effective power and open a front against the forces that keep us unfree. Thank you all so much for joining us, and let's hand it over to Max, Chris, and Tobi.
Thanks so much, Jess, and thank you, Chris and Tobi, for joining us tonight or today. Yeah, I guess I'm going to introduce a little bit about the book as a project, and then talk about Chris very briefly, and then talk about what he's arguing, and then hand it over to Mr. Nealon here. So this book is a text that I edited from the materials that I could find and access after Christopher Chitty died in 2015. They were the sort of drafts of his PhD thesis, which he was working on in the History of Consciousness department at the University of California in Santa Cruz. And it was work that I'd been kind of familiar with, I guess, since I knew him from my time there, and I had been like eagerly awaiting its completion and its publication. And so when he died, I was kind of, I was doubly grieving him and this thing that I'd been very excited for, and which I felt needed to exist in the world. And so I kind of found myself, just without somehow even deciding to engage in this process of putting it together so that others could read it, as well as me, so that I could read it. Yeah, so in Sexual Hegemony, Chris sort of pulls together a couple of different conversations. He is doing what he says is returning the history of sexuality to the history of property, which is bringing obviously these two pretty enormous fields into conversation that, you know, obviously have been in some sort of dialogue, but perhaps not to the extent that Chris or others felt was sufficient. And so in particular, obviously, this means kind of reading Foucault with Marx again. So in particular, his way of approaching Foucault is to say that in his account of the history of sexuality, he makes a compelling argument about the sort of transformation of human experience around the rise of the sort of early modern state. But he doesn't account for, through the imposition of this sort of bourgeois epistemology or self-understanding, but he doesn't account for how that became sort of implanted in people's actual experience. And so what he does that's interesting in this book is kind of embed that story in a world systems theory history of the transition to capitalism, with a sort of longue durée look at the Mediterranean basin, drawing from Fernand Braudel and Giovanni Arrighi's account in the long 20th century. And so he sort of stages a number of flashpoints around the policing of sodomy that he finds correspond to moments of hegemonic crisis or transition, which in Arrighi's understanding is marked by financialization. And he finds that this is a way into seeing how bourgeois polities are able to produce and control these new populations of proletarians, which they have to sort of violently expel from peasant life ways, where they have kind of an organic relation to their own means of reproduction, and turn them into something like proletarians or wage laborers, even though the wage is not the only way that these people relate to their sudden existence in bourgeois polities. So he talks about, or he looks at these moments of crisis in sort of Medici Florence. He has this really incredible archive that the historian Jesse Rock sort of discovered in the records from this this office that the Florentine Republic establishes, called the Officers of the Night, which is basically set up only to police sodomy. And he finds that this sort of generates an intensification of discourses around sodomy, whereas before sort of male same-sex sex existed as a kind of like unremarkable aspect of sex-segregated public space and work situations that is sort of stratified by age. Now, because they have this sort of attempt at policing it, it becomes this politically volatile tool that various factions can kind of deploy against one another in this sort of in this weird moment where they're attempting to establish a republican form of government. They're also sort of going through one of the earlier transitions to sort of capitalist relations of production in cloth and wool manufacture. They are experiencing these sort of financial crises where they're trying to invest in various overseas ventures, and they suffer these sort of fiscal crises. And he makes the argument that it was this question of the policing of relations between men through sexuality that expressed one of the main forms that these sort of newly proletarianized populations had to grasp their new form of domination to the bourgeoisie. And so he goes on to kind of locate a couple of other moments like this and these crisis points. There's another one in Amsterdam. There was a sort of panic around the discovery of these sort of sodomitical networks in Amsterdam and the surrounding provinces that coincides with the sort of Dutch crisis of its hegemony. He then sort of deviates from the Arrighian schema and looks at Paris and in the sort of revolutionary, post-revolutionary situation where there are all these kind of less accusatory and more kind of satirical texts that are circulating, where sort of they're in the royal gardens that had been expropriated by the revolutionary mob for cruising and sex work. The residents there kind of make a sort of satirical like declaration of the rights of buggers, basically, as a kind of riposte to the bourgeois pronouncements that are happening in the kind of official government buildings nearby. It continues. He looks again at various uprisings in around London that have to do with decommissioned sailors, and in New York around mobilizations for World War I and World War II, where FDR, when he was I think the undersecretary for the Navy, sort of sends out these kind of like investigators to see what kind of activity the sailors are up to in the bases, and discovers an equally extensive network of sodomitical intrigue, and this is all to sort of narrate not a sort of like unbroken chain, but to say that there is a cycle of moments when sex between men becomes more visible, socially visible to the state, and the state, because the capitalist state is in crisis at these moments of hegemonic transition, finds it important to intervene in human sexuality and bring its repressive forces to bear on these populations that are sort of in and out of the stable wage relation. This is all to substantiate this idea that he generates, that he comes up with, of sexual hegemony, which is where the sexual behaviors of one group affect the sexual behaviors of another group, whether or not they have much to do with the sort of conditions that this first group comes from. So why would it be that proletarian populations have any concern for whether or not their sexuality is in comportment with what the bourgeoisie needs, which has to do with the sort of the maintenance of the family, the household, and property transmission, when for most of the history of capital sexual relations, bourgeoisie has basically no interest in what the proletarian population does outside of the work hour, the working day, and proletarian populations have no way of accessing what the sort of the bourgeoisie is up to sexually. They don't have private rooms. They don't have sort of access to the medical infrastructure that they might need to keep their body clean in the same way that you would need to be sexually active. and yeah, I guess that's a very sort of broad summary of what's in the book. There's also a number of more historiographical reflections, but I guess I'll sort of stop there and turn it over to Chris to get a better sense of like how this is all to be understood in the context of the sort of disciplinary formations that these were an intervention into.
Great, thank you, Max. Before I get started, I mean, I think it should be clear to everybody in our gathering that this book would not exist without Max. He's very modest in his description of assembling the text that we're talking about today, but it was an extraordinary labor to be able to do this, an editorial one, an emotional one, clearly, and then a labor to make sure that it was the very best version of itself that it could be. And just, you know, the text that Max produced is a really special thing. So thank you, Max, for doing that. I think a lot of people who are reading it right now and who will be reading it in times to come are going to feel that gratitude as well. And thanks to the folks who put this together at Duke today. Thanks to Jess and to Dan. And thank you to Tobi for agreeing to facilitate a conversation on sexual hegemony. I think it's going to be a really great thing to be able to do. And of course, thanks to everybody for showing up. I have maybe 1 degree further away, removed from the text. I was the beneficiary of Max's editorial labors throughout and was able to look at something pretty coherent by the time it had become my happy task to try to frame it for future readers. I mentioned in my introduction to the volume that I only met Chris once, actually. I was teaching at Berkeley still, I think, and or at least visiting Berkeley, and we met, Chris and I, at a cafe in downtown Berkeley to talk about the possibility of my helping him think through this dissertation project at Santa Cruz. And as he described it, what he was up to, what he planned to do, and what he was busy doing, I got more and more excited because even the barest description of his project made it clear to me that his work had the possibility of really providing new coordinates for people working in the history of sexuality, and really maybe calling into question some of the terms of the longstanding debates in queer studies, at least in the US. And that had to do with the way that, and this is something that Max mentioned, but that had to do with the way that Chris wanted to reperiodize the history of sexuality, the way he wanted to think about cycles of capitalist accumulation as containing possible flashpoints for the policing of sexuality. He wanted to think about whether times of transition between one mode of capitalist strategy and another produced forms of social disorder and worry that made it imperative or urgent to police people. And my head was spinning. And so I jumped at the chance to be able to work on the dissertation, and was grateful to learn after Chris's death that Max and Chris's other friends and comrades in the Bay Area had really committed to making sure that this work would see the light of day. So when it came time for me to try to put together an introduction, I wanted to do something pretty straightforward so that I could help out and then maybe get out of the way of the text. And what that ended up looking like for me was just providing some coordinates for work that it seemed like Chris was making good use of, and that were serving as the materials out of which he kind of built his launch pad. And so in very brief, I'm gonna just mention some of those things for you now, so that if you're either reading the book in a reading group or taking a look at it by yourself right now or thinking about diving into it pretty soon, I might be able to help give you a head start on some of the things that he does in such interesting ways. So, first of all, just the title of the book, Sexual Hegemony, uses this term, hegemony, that comes to most of us through the thinking of Antonio Gramsci. And Max has already identified some of the ways that that term, that concept does work for Chris. I think it's really interesting to think about Gramsci's thinking in the context of Italy, a place like the US which has been historically marked by really uneven economic development between its northern and southern regions, which has in very different ways, of course, lightly even racialized those differences on top of class differences, the way the urban populations in the north of Italy thought about the peasant populations of the south is the subject of very interesting histories all their own, which Chris was tapping into. But I wanted to begin when I was writing my introduction with thinking about the way that Chris put that idea of hegemony to use. And he closely linked it to a Machiavellian idea of statecraft. And I'm always touched, and I always kind of smile when I think about the interest and attraction of Machiavelli for Chris, who I think took pleasure, at least on the basis of what I've read, in being able to think of himself as a bit Machiavellian. He labels his methodology at the beginning of the text queer realism, and the realism there I think is a kind of realpolitik. He wanted to have as few illusions as possible about contemporary queer politics. And those things included illusions about the necessarily liberatory character of any given sexuality, the necessarily progressive character of the development of a sexual identity. In that he shares, of course, argumentative coordinates with Foucault. And I think that's a really important and kind of wonderful thing that he backs up as far as he does. Another way that the idea of hegemony through a kind of realist political lens is of use to Chris is that he is able to see that inter-class struggles and intra-class competition both have roles to play in shaping how the male homosexuality that he's tracking ends up pivoting in one direction or another across the course of time. And I think that partly has to do with Chris's sensitivity to class struggles in a slightly expanded frame. He is capable of seeing those things not just as, or he's inviting us to see those things not just as a kind of head-to-head between an emergent bourgeoisie and an emergent proletariat, but as a contest in which the bourgeoisie and the proletariat are being tugged in different directions by peasantries and aristocracies. So there's actually, in an overlapping sense, like at least 4 differently classed and differently positioned parties contending for survival, in the cases of the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie for dominance. And what that expanded class frame does, like in the best Marxist work, is allow a project in which hegemony can take so many different forms, and in which the thing being worked on, sexuality, can have so many different political valences. So in the account, Chris begins to develop elite, inter-elite competition, factional competition, competition for the right and power to steer the accumulation of wealth, say in the Italian city-states or in subsequent cycles for the Dutch or for the British. Those forms of intra-class competition themselves weaponize the charge of sodomy, just as the charge of sodomy could be used to discipline populations, laboring populations that were often vagrant populations. So that idea of hegemony, though drawn from Gramsci, with its Machiavellian twist and with its expanded class frame, becomes the basis for what Max was describing as Chris's extraordinary archive. I mean, if you begin to read through the text, his historical frame of reference is quite wide. Sometimes he's looking at the work of anthropologists, feminist anthropologists and archaeologists, in order to begin to think about what, for instance, the displacement from peasant forms of labor in the Mediterranean basin really meant in terms of not just migration to the city, but in terms of the people who were left behind. So this is a long way of saying that using that idea of hegemony alone, I think begins to give you a sense of how various and how probative this book really is. Max already mentioned the really innovative turn to a periodization outside the one we're most familiar with. In US and British and most European studies of the history of sexuality, we depend on Foucault's modernity story, the story of the rise of sexual science, which is broadly linked to a notion of the Enlightenment. Foucault generally is seen as distinguishing himself from Marx by saying, hey, you would think, and I'm thinking of the History of Sexuality, Volume 1 here, you would think that the bourgeois experiments in developing sexual discipline would be weapons from the get-go against lower classes to discipline them, to make them more efficient. But in fact, says Foucault, what I seem to be discovering is that the origins of sexual science are a series of self-applications, experiments on the selfhoods, the emerging selfhoods of ruling classes, which then in various kind of contingent and surprising ways, end up being sources of discipline in a more traditionally vertical or more traditionally Marxist sense, related, that is to say, to labor discipline. Already a very interesting and upending story if it's the 1980s, but what Chris, as a really close reader of Foucault, does, moving on from his reading of Gramsci and thinking in his thoughts about hegemony, is to say, let's back that up a second and think about why the bourgeoisie was interested in performing these attacks on itself in the first place. To say that enlightenment is the reason isn't really much of an answer. And so there's a whole way to trace the argument of sexual hegemony that has to do with trying to tell, frankly, a better story than Foucault's story, one that's hitched more to questions of intra-class competition, such that factions or aspects of bourgeois society are kind of pitted against each other in a struggle for dominance and for the opportunity to control statecraft. That opens up more history in certain ways than Foucault's History of Sexuality was able to do. And it certainly includes what Foucault is identifying as subsequent forms of sexual discipline applied to working classes, but it also keeps open whole stories of sexuality that have to do with peasants becoming proletarians. And I'm moving my hand like this because I'm imagining young men, as Chris does, starting in the landed interior around the Mediterranean and migrating to the cities, or getting involved in maritime labor, becoming seasonal workers on ships. And all these things involve forms of separation, just like the forms of separation Marx describes in medieval Europe in his histories of primitive accumulation. Separation or expulsion from peasant lifeways in which there's, say, too many children to feed or to support. And so second or third or fourth sons have to go and figure out a way to survive someplace else, and end up becoming part of circuits of accumulation in emergent forms of capital accumulation or struggle. So just those things right there would make this a really stunning intervention into the history of sexuality. But there's more. I think in addition to his revisiting of Foucault and his interesting use of Machiavelli and Gramsci and his periodization by way of Arrighi's use of this cycles of accumulation, Chris opens up a whole bunch of potential conversations for the rest of us that he himself was not able quite to finish. And in the second part of my introduction, I try to talk a little bit about the opportunities that this book opens up to think, if we're thinking of histories of sexuality through property and struggles over access to accumulation, to think about, of course, the long feminist history, anthropological histories, literary histories, of what it means for women to have been construed as property over the course of the last, 500, 600, 700 years, even if we restrict ourselves to the longest story of the rise of capital, not to mention the history of patriarchy. So in the later portion of the introduction, I try to suggest some of the places where feminist scholarship, which contributes to Chris's study, could be a richer conversation with it as this book begins to circulate. And in that text, I mentioned just two examples. One, a kind of like close-in study of a particular period, Sharon Marcus's Between Women, which also thinks about the internals, what's inside property relations, heterosexual marriage, that paradoxically creates space for women to build certain kinds of relationships that look one way if they're in one class position, and other ways if they're outside certain forms of class-based safety. And then I tried to think a little bit about the implications for Chris's work if it were brought in contact with stories and studies of patriarchy in longer historical frameworks, like the work of Maria Mies or the work of Silvia Federici in a book like Caliban and the Witch. Federici's story, as many of you may know, is also a story about how a certain set of separations or dispossessions produce a very modern looking binary, gender roles for women and men. That in Federici's historical story didn't look that way until certain forms of early capital accumulation made it necessary to separate out what would become regular waged labor from other kinds of labor that would support the wage. And that inside-outside dynamic is kind of the place I ask readers to begin thinking about maybe one last contemporary connecting point for Chris's sexual hegemony. Over the last 10 years or so, since the 2008 financial crisis, if you're watching the scholarship and the activist writing taking place online and in print, I think you can begin to see a particular way that a return to Marx looks different from earlier returns to Marx in moments of social upheaval, like the great student revolts of the 1960s, or even the great waves of decolonization in the mid-20th century. I think one thing that is quietly linking a lot of new anti-capitalist study is an attention to the possibilities in exactly the way that Marx, late on in Capital Volume 1, in this particular chapter, it's chapter 25, he calls it the general law of capitalist accumulation. The way that Marx begins to think about being kept out of the wage and expelled from the wage and prevented from staying in the wage is at least as important to capitalist history as the history of the people who were dragooned into surviving only by way of the wage. And Maria Mies, in her work on patriarchy and accumulation, says, hey, you know, if you think about women, nature, and colonies as the externals to the wage that make the life of the wage, the miserable life of the wage possible, you begin to get a fuller picture. And of course, the whole great flourishing in the last 5 or 10 years of studies of racial capitalism, following on work by people like Du Bois and Cedric Robinson, has asked us to add the word slaves to that formulation of Maria Mies's. What outside the wage has to be policed, has to be managed, has to be kept free or cheap, like the phrase cheap nature that the Marxist eco-critic Jason Moore comes up with, so that those of us that are lucky enough to struggle for a wage can keep capitalists in the business of extracting surplus value. So that's just a really quick and dirty introduction to some of the places that I think Chris built his argument out of, the mix of which is really extraordinary in its unexpectedness and its innovativeness, but also what I hope and will be some of the places that this text could go. So that's what I got for right now, but thanks again to all of you for coming, and I think we're going to turn it over to Tobi now for some questions for me and Max, and then we'll hopefully have plenty of time to open it up for you all to type questions in the Q&A box.
Thank you. So again, just want to echo Chris in thanking Max for his heroic devotion and making this all possible. And thank you to Chris and Jess and Dan and to everyone who's here. I guess I want to begin my comments/questions by picking up where Chris just left off and thinking about who's excluded from the wage and the category of surplus, which ends up having a pretty profound structuring power for the argument of sexual hegemony. Again, it's an unfinished project, but also it's a bounded project. It can't purport to answer every question. But because he insists that sexuality is a crucial dimension of primitive accumulation, it's worth talking, as Chris was already pointing to, other points of primitive accumulation. And I wonder what it would look like for someone else or someone far in the future to try and write a kind of interlinked history that actually accounts for something like racialization, depending on how you define it. I mean, you could take the long durée that Cedric Robinson opts for and say, actually, racialization has always been a part of capital accumulation, and actually even predates capital and was a way to racialize the lower classes under feudalism. So actually, racial hierarchy justifies capitalist hierarchy and makes it more continuous with feudalism than previously thought. I mean, that's one way of taking it. Or you could go with somebody like Oliver Cromwell Cox, who insists that, you know, race as a concept begins around the time that capitalist accumulation and capitalist labor discipline begins, which happens to be around the time when sexual hegemony begins. I don't have any answers, but I do think it would be an interesting project to think about how, on the one hand, you have those who are expropriated from their peasant territories and their means of reproduction within Europe, who are also being kind of conscripted to a system that necessarily relies upon, not just in the Federician sense, the ongoing primitive accumulation that is the enclosure of women, but also slavery and colonialism. I don't mean to say that as an abstract fact, but also to point to points in sexual hegemony where race cannot but be relevant. He points to the fact that at some point, you know, sodomy is referred to as the vice of the East, and there are many different places where the pseudoscience of race is actually seen as working in cooperation with scientia sexualis and kind of pathologizing sodomy necessarily relies upon the kind of characterization of all kinds of surplus people, including sodomites, as somehow ethnically other. They belong to some different people. So again, I mean, I don't think that's an answer that either Chris or Max should be prepared to give right now, but I do think it would be interesting to think about surplus and its many guises as running alongside this history of sodomy and statecraft. Yeah. One potentially smaller question that is nevertheless very interesting to me is how what is undoubtedly a very ambitious and gratifying project, even in its unfinished form, might impact something like literary studies. And I'm just thinking about the fact that sexual hegemony focuses not on production, but on reproduction. And obviously the two circuits are necessarily linked, but I was thinking about canonical text and literary criticism, the political unconscious, and to vulgarize it completely, it's just like, okay, narrative becomes a socially symbolic act, not because it is, you know, a novel's plot is absolutely indexical for the mode of production, but actually it's a solution to overlapping problems, usually best dramatized by the friction between different modes of production. So, I mean, if we talk about the realist novel, it's all about the accession of the bourgeoisie, yada, yada, yada. And obviously the ways in which they have to, in some ways, demonize or supersede the aristocracy. I was just thinking about Jameson, who takes Balzac as a kind of axiomatic example in the political unconscious, and he would return to Balzac, and you know, Balzac as the narrator of the emergence of the bourgeoisie, who was himself a legitimist. He had actually kind of political affiliations with the old guard, which is why Marx and Engels loved him so much. They thought, you know, he's better than Zola. He understands how a fading ruling class thinks. I was just thinking about the fact that we might, under the light of Chris Chitty's book, think not only of narrative of having something to do with mode of production, but also in representations of sodomy as having something to do with the relation between narrative and capitalist reproduction. This is perhaps kind of cheap of me, but one of the most canonical examples and early examples of homosexuality is Vautrin in Balzac's Père Goriot. And the marriage plot of this book, I mean, the elaborate kind of narrative apparatus is set off because there's a gay criminal who has escaped from prison who basically convinces the protagonist to get married. I mean, this is somebody moving from outside of the heterosexual couple form, basically forcing somebody into hegemonic marriage relations. And I mean, I can't help myself, so I'm just going to read some of this. But his whole plan is to go to the New World. So Vautrin says to Rastignac, I myself cherish an ideal. My ideal existence is that of a patriarch dwelling upon a vast estate, say 100,000 acres in one of the southern states of North America. I should like to be a planter, to own slaves, and amass a few millions by selling my cattle, my tobacco and timber. There, living like a king with every creature around me subject to my will, I should lead a sort of life not conceived of in this country, where people crowd themselves in streets of stucco. I am a poet, only my poems are not made in verse. They have their rise in sentiment, and I turn them into action. I possess at this moment about 50,000 francs, which would barely buy me 40 Negroes. I want 200,000 francs because I need 200 Negroes to carry out my dreams of patriarchal existence. You see, Negroes are ready-made children. You may do whatever you please with them without any inquisitive procureur du roi pouncing down upon you with questions. With this black capital, in 10 years, I should make 3 or 4 millions. If I succeed, no man will ask, who are you? I shall be Mr. 4 Millions, citizen of the United States. I mean, I'm being vulgar, but that is such a literal instance of the history of sodomy and primitive accumulation, and also the move from European capitals of capital to the United States. I don't know what an ingenious Jamesonian reading of that would be, but there must be other examples like that. And I do think it's interesting that in Oscar Wilde's Soul of Man Under Socialism, he refers to Vautrin, but he disavows him. He's just like, you know, crime as a result of starvation and poverty, they're not psychologically interesting. They're not like Macbeth. They're not like Vautrin. And it's the only real reference to homosexuality in the entire text, and it's purely as criminal. So my very broad and at this point unnecessarily long question is, I mean, can you think of any other kind of literary or interpretive implications for this focus on reproduction? Joining reproduction to primitive accumulation and thinking about how narrative is structured. And also just like heterogeneity. I mean, we're talking about the lumpen proletariat. I mean, you could look at Marx's own writings and realize how surplus, except for when he tries to really pin it down in Capital, in his political writings, it's very difficult for him to kind of group it all into a single narrative form because of that problem of reproduction. So a very open-ended question is to kind of see what your reaction is to that and see if you can think of any other ways forward from Chitty's text.
I mean, that is just such a great, I mean, just your questions are already the beginning of the afterlife of this text. And I think that's fantastic. I mean, Max, don't let me jump. I mean, in theory, I'm a trained literary critic, so I want to sort of like tackle that with excitement in a really preliminary way. But I mean, one of the things I think that's interesting about this contemporary turn in Marxist thinking to say general laws of accumulation, the production of reserve armies, the importance of the histories of people who've been excluded or prevented from entering the wage relation is heterogeneity. The reserve army in chapter 25 has 4 strata, and it's probably the closest in the 3 volumes of Capital that Marx is going to get to what you described, Tobi, an attempt to kind of at least begin to perform some sort of anatomy of this moving and internally contradictory population. But one of the things that I think that internal differentiation, that multiplication of what you could almost call class positions or class relations does is it kind of forces you to think of like, okay, well, there's class, but then there's value and the imperative to produce surplus value and all the crazy things that have to happen, all the violence that has to happen inside and outside the wage relation to make surplus value keep going. And if you think about literary plots and literary character systems in terms of gradations of value, I mean, I tend to think of the possibilities in chapter 25 and in those moments of discussions of reserve armies and surplus populations as descriptions of like gradated human disposability. And I mean, then you're quite close to say, just to take one very quick example, like Alex Wallach's studies of like character systems. What's a minor character in a novel doing? What happens when a minor character talks to another minor character? What do the tones of tragedy and dignity and comedy do to different outcomes in marriage plots? The marriages that transfer a lot of property, the marriages that are property inconsequential. You know, how are characters valued and devalued in various ways? What are the narrative techniques of foregrounding and backgrounding? I mean, just in a very basic way. But then you made me think of poetry because your Vautrin quote made me, I mean, it sounds like the young Rimbaud, you know, I mean, about to go adventuring in Africa, right? And it's like seeing the limits of what poetry can accomplish, that has also seen the briefly opened horizon formed by the Paris Commune and wants to do something of almost like allegorical significance, become like some utterly different kind of person, you know? So, I mean, there would be implications, I think, for the history of poetry as it thinks about its relation to value too. And there, of course, you know, Christian Ross's work on the Paris Commune is a way of thinking about moments, Juliana Spar calls them state provisional moments where things crack open, right, in the forms of policing and crisis management that we know are destabilized. So all those things, I don't know, would be really different than what to me is a kind of like Kantianism in Frederick Jameson. Like Capital has begun to be able to produce so much that we need a critique of critical arrogance. Like you can't know Capital in its totality. Like there's just no way, it's sublime. And the best thing we can do is look at the moments of transfer, where as you said, like one dying class is passing the baton to perhaps another social formation, and keep our eyes in that zone there. And that has its interest as well. It's certainly different than the scientism of early in the 20th century, where the Marxist critic was like, I can explain history, I have all the answers. For the generation around Jameson, it was like this productive reduction in what we could conceivably and realistically track, you know, with the pathos of like one thing becoming another. But I think the equipment that comes out of readings of Marx to do with surplus population begin to give us a whole different set of tools. I mean, that's kind of an amazing thing to think about. So I love that. I'll shut up for a second. Max, over to you. And I do have some thoughts about Stuart Hall in particular, but I'll save that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not at all trained as a literary theorist, so I don't have anywhere near as much to say there, but that, I mean, that was such an exquisite quote or example that you found, I think. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I just want to say this discussion is what I was hoping for, I guess, when I embarked on getting this published. I wanted to see what people would do with these theories, and see like what would happen when it came into contact with you know, different corpuses that it didn't contain. But yeah, I mean, I would just say to the beginning of that question about how do we think about racialization and colonization and things like that. That was one of the big sort of like questions I had in my mind as I was going through all the material, to see if he would address it at all or properly. I mean, there's moments certainly you notice, you know, where he talks about yeah, that passage where he talks about Burton and the sort of Enlightenment philosophes like encounter with like the sexual like undifferentiated bodies of the Americas or whatever, as a kind of like foil of the more pronounced sexual dimorphism of the colonists. And yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that I think is unfortunately just we'll have to sort of generate ourselves or use speculatively. But definitely, I mean, obviously the sort of, for me, the obvious application of this would be thinking about how natural increase works in the history of like American slavery, where after sort of like the slave trade itself was outlawed to certain colonies, people still had to, or slave holders still had to somehow reproduce and even grow populations of the people they were holding in chattel. And obviously that would require an entirely new sort of set of archives and applications of this schema. But I think it would be a really productive complement. I think it would, yeah, I think really enrich this concept of how the hegemony of the sort of like metropole related to how it was able to be dominant in the first place.
It looks like we're going to start to get questions, but I really did want to say that to the first part of your remarks, Toby, I found myself thinking recently a lot about Stuart Hall's 1978 book called Policing the Crisis, which is an attempt to begin to think about what would soon be Thatcherite neoliberalism. But the subtitle is so interesting to think about in relation to the title we ended up giving to Chris's book. And the full description is Policing the Crisis, Mugging State and Law and Order. You know, and it, as with, you know, for readers approaching Chris's book and thinking like statecraft and capital, okay, world system, but then there's the word sodomy in the middle. They're like statecraft and sodomy and capital. Sodomy, it's so specific, right? And similarly, like the word mugging, like, but you know, as the British state begins to start to re-racialize and figure out new forms of policing subaltern populations, the specter of mugging becomes the pretext, right? For those new forms of policing, much in the way that sodomy becomes the weaponizable, if initially small looking tool for a new configuration of class domination. So that's not even to mention all the other things that Hall ends up having to say about hegemony that I think are conjunct with, you know, with what Chris wants to say about it. And so there might be, I hope, future scholars who do exactly that. So just one little thing, it seemed irresistible not to try to mention that. Can I ask Jess, are you, are folks just writing directly to the whole
It looks like we have folks we have folks using a combination of methods. So we do have a question here. Where would you place or think with ideas of oikonomia, a nexus of race, class, sexuality from Angela Metropoulos's Contract and Contagion in relation to the ideas explored within the book?
I don't know that book. It looks like it's a 2012 volume about periodized around neoliberalism and the biopolitics of the household. But I have only that very general sense of the book. So I'm not sure how to, it sounds really exciting, but I'm not sure how I would answer that question. I don't know if you guys have read the book.
Yeah, I'm somewhat familiar, and I'm not positive how I would answer that question. I mean, Angela is a theorist who I really like a lot, and as I've been working on this book, I've become more familiar with her stuff as well, and it's obvious to me that there are some sort of points of connection, but I feel a little put on the spot because it was one of the things I was hoping to sort of, once I put this down, to sort of sit down and think through more systematically. I think that, I mean, she has a number of really productive ideas around, yeah, this sort of, the way that obviously the contract has to do with this historic transition period as well, around sort of the dissolution of feudal sort of peasant modes, and it's the way that it's certain forms of patriarchy get reproduced and transformed as they become taken up into the capitalist social relations. I don't know that Chris was working at all directly with her concepts, but there's very clear resonance to me. Yeah, I think that, yeah, I think the archives and things that he's working with certainly lend themselves to an application, but sort of like you've been saying, Chris, like it's so varied. He's going in so many different directions as well. It's kind of hard to simply reduce it to these sort of more like formal questions, I guess. But yeah, I think that's a really productive direction for this to go, for sure.
I will say, while you were talking, Max, I poked around, and on the AK Press site for the book, it talks about migration politics. And one thing, I mentioned this in my introduction, that I think is really exciting and interesting is that the histories of, you know, of displacement and migration, forced migration, or forced in the sense of like having a place to go except wherever there might be a way to survive, is in Chitty's work a prehistory of modern sexuality more than sexual science. So like, who were the precursors of gay people? Vagabonds. And one of the things about displacement in that text also is that it is linked to contagion. There's a lot of stuff, I mean, especially in the era of COVID, there's a lot of stuff in Chris's work about earlier epidemics and pandemics. So he talks about syphilis, he talks about the contagions that travel from Europeans to the colonies in the first waves of colonization. And of course, much of his sense of retrospect of militancies possible and blunted has to do with the normalization of homosexuality in the later phases of the activism around AIDS. So there's a way to trace Chris's biopolitical thinking, again, as kind of drawing on Foucault, but thinking, I think, past Foucault, because it's cross-hashed with histories of migration and with class and accumulation in a more direct way. But that for him, keep changing how we are sexuated. There's really interesting just offhand remarks about the whole public health infrastructure that makes it possible to sort of like swipe on Grindr and like safely go have sex with somebody and not think about it. So not knowing this book, but just like thinking about some of the things that it seems to be about, I think the way that Chris talks about biopolitics, epidemics, migration, might connect up with this thematics of contagion that you're talking about. So it looks like there's another one, Jess, is that right?
Yep, I just wanted to leave Tobi an opportunity to try. Okay, cool. Yes, we do have another question. I was struck by the shifting solidarities between Chitty's subjects and sex workers in the text. Would love to hear more about these connections and also where they break down.
Yeah, that's I'm glad you brought the stuff about the vagabonds up, because yeah, it's interesting that he while he wants to sort of on the one hand tell a story about sodomy and the prehistory of sort of homosexualities, he can't not tell that by talking about migrants, people who are criminalized by vagrancy laws, and sex workers. It's always these populations that get apprehended by whatever sort of attempts by the state to control sexuality. So basically what that means is people who are, for whatever reason, left to reproduce themselves outside of the household. And that's, I think, another way to bring that back into Angela's work. Yeah, so the scene that I was referencing before about in the French Revolution, there's these really incredible texts that I guess a coalition of sodomites and sex workers publish to vindicate their rights against the revolution that isn't sort of willing or able to sort of incorporate them into their this new sort of citizen subject. And certainly once he gets to the sort of the later period where we're talking about like the modern homosexual movement that is making a bid for sort of bourgeois respectability, unsurprisingly that that involves a kind of distancing from sex work, and as well as from the sort of transient or houseless populations that historically had always kind of made up what this sort of political subjectivity was. And I think, yeah, I mean, you know, I think he would have found a lot of interesting material to work with current struggles around Fasta Sesta as being the sort of vehicle for sort of maybe I don't know, I wouldn't, yeah, certainly a crackdown on sex work, maybe less so on like homosexualities or sodomy or whatever, but yeah, these sort of the link between these like deviant subject positions and the tools that the state uses to go after sex workers and traffickers also. So the migrant question again somehow is all related.
I would also, I mean, I think that what I'm perceiving is actually present in Chitty's book, but what I think is very interesting is the interpretive texture he gives to the question of class within the imagined community of sodomites, in that instead of opting for the naturalized hypothesis that, well, actually, homosexuals are evenly and democratically distributed among every class, he says, no, I mean, there are specific points of intra-class and inter-class conflict, as Chris was saying, such that the category isn't about simply naturalizing an abstract sexuality that happens to be projected onto an otherwise stable social field, but is actually produced by the very abrasion between, say, the subject position, or rather the class position of somebody who might be a sodomite and yet might not have to reproduce themselves outside the wage in exactly the same way. But one thing that, and this is just me selfishly insisting on mentioning another thing that I was going to, but my earlier comments went on too long. He brings up 1848 a lot, and just again, the question of heterogeneity, and he actually even brings up the July Revolution. I was just thinking about what the implications for rethinking a lot of Marx's own writing, or rethinking a lot of Marx's thinking about surplus population would look like if you're to somehow insert sodomy into the lists of kind of constituent parts of the lumpen proletariat. Maybe it would change nothing, but just, again, I came armed with this piece of paper. So I'm going to read from the 18th Brumaire. It's just a funny list. This is, Louis Napoleon has this street gang called the Society of December the 10th. And this is actually a moment of intra-class conflict between different parts of the bourgeoisie who end up completely divesting themselves of their legislative power in service of the executive. So again, a moment of hegemonic crisis. And the people who are supporting Louis Napoleon are, alongside decayed roués with dubious means of subsistence and of dubious origin, alongside ruined and adventurous offshoots of the bourgeoisie, were vagabonds, discharged soldiers, discharged jailbirds, escaped galley slaves, swindlers, mountebanks, lazzaroni, pickpockets, tricksters, gamblers, maquereaux, those are pimps, brothel keepers, porters, literati, organ grinders, rag pickers, knife grinders, tinkers, beggars, in short, the whole indefinite disintegrated mass thrown hither and thither, which the French call la bohème. So, I mean, the bohemian category actually includes these kind of useless members of the so-called bourgeoisie. It also includes pimps and brothel keepers and rag pickers and knife grinders. It also includes a category called the literati, which isn't defined with any more specificity. But it is one of those moments where there actually might normally be some sort of more definite or sharper class antagonism between a sodomite who does not feel the need to engage in sex work. But in these moments of hegemonic crisis, like Chris is saying, they become politically indistinguishable. I mean, if we believe Marx, it's the presence of these people that kind of guaranteed a rollback of many of the supposed liberties won by the bourgeoisie in the French Revolution. That's what I think for now.
We have another question. This is a question for Chris, specifically. In your introduction, I really like the argument about the resonances between capitalism and gay identity in Chitty's book, and your argument that D'Amelio stops short of following out the implications of his argument by a turn into social democracy, homosexuality versus the family rather than homosexuality versus capitalism. Would you be willing to speculate about what a more robust elaboration of the implications of Chitty's book for contemporary politics might look like?
That is such a fantastic question, but I can't resist, first of all, after that amazing litany of Tobi's. Earlier today, I was in this seminar where we were talking about chapter 10 of Capital Volume 1, which is the very long chapter on the working day, and there's a section 3 of chapter 10, where Marx is describing sectors of industry with no legal limits. So places where the workers, there's kind of no bottom to the kind of exploitation that they suffer. And it's an interesting corollary to your list. It's not as wonderfully comical, but for various reasons, the lace trade, pot makers, matchmakers who get tetanus from spending long hours in closed rooms with phosphorus and get lockjaw, paper hangers, bakers whose bread is adulterated, railway workers, dressmakers, hat makers, and of course blacksmiths. So, I mean, the tendency towards motley is something that I think Chris is super interested in throughout this book, and that's actually, it's a narrative thing, it's a political thing, and it's also kind of a methodological thing all at the same time. That might be the beginning of an answer to this wonderful question of Heather's. So, in her question, she's talking about a moment, I guess, towards the end of the introduction to Sexual Hegemony, where I quote a fair bit of a really wonderful essay of John D'Amelio's right at the beginning of the Reagan era, where he's saying that, because of, it's not quite queer people yet, because it's like 1983, so like lesbian and gay positionings outside any comfortable relation to the heterosexual nuclear family, at least so far, we are well positioned at the beginning of this long economic downturn to think about how to take pressure off of that little cellular form of capitalist reproduction, because we never got to enjoy its benefits past adolescence anyway. And so we could be the ones that think innovatively about proto-socialist forms like better daycare centers, free schools, networks of care among chosen families. So D'Amelio does some wonderful sort of free thinking at that moment in that essay. And I say that he's kind of, it's the early 80s, maybe, it might be, yeah, but the beginning of a long downturn. But things are so much worse by the time Chris is looking back at the previous 3 decades and thinking forward to what might be next. And for all those of us that get on social media and like curse 2020, we know this feeling. Widening swaths of proletarianization that will probably not lead to the opportunities of a queer-led democratic socialist politics of abundance that D'Amelio was so generously imagining. One of the things that Chris begins to track in very prescient ways, I think, is deepening precarity among more and more kinds of people that for him lead, especially among the young people of today, to what he calls, he has 2 names for it. One is like de-differentiation of class mores. So like what it means to be queer and sexually free and open looks less different. There are less different versions of it across class vertical strata than there once were. And he's leaning on the work of Perry Anderson's studies in the postmodern, where in classic, fashion, the narration of the dawn of the postmodern era is the collapse of high and low. So de-differentiation of social mores is one way that Chris, I think, could be mobilized to start to think about an age of widening precarity and how a queer politics might look if it's not a politics of, say, reviving the family form by making it more open-ended. But the other term he uses, borrowed from Lauren Berlin, is the word de-dramatization. And it's related to, I think, certain kinds of motley. Many different ways, and Chris has a wonderful passage, kind of narrates, like the once very class different ways of being a queer all melded into one sort of person, who participates, let's say they're a kind of homonormative white gay man who goes to a HRC event and it's black tie and you fundraise and a gay or lesbian or trans celebrity tells you some optimistic things about how we're all equal and dignified. But then, afterwards, like changes clothes, goes to a leather bar and has a hookup in which certain, formerly deviant considered sexual behaviors, even side queerness, are indulged and enjoyed. Whatever. Another version in some ways of a postmodern argument. But I think at root, one of the things that Chris enables us to do is actually reperiodize, and instead of thinking that we're in a postmodern age where high and low have collapsed, think about what that itself is an effect of. And that brings us back actually to Tobi's earlier remarks about somebody like Jameson, who was, of course, also early on trying to think about what the postmodern might mean. To reduce it all to something really brief, I would just say that as opposed to a story of ever more spectacular productivity, the postmodern generation of our inability to tell front from back, left from right, the past from the future, we could begin to think about a long crisis of accumulation in which the postmodern was the first sign of a potentially universalizable precarity for everybody except the people who are going to go with Elon Musk to Mars. What does that sexuality look like for the 99% or for the rest of us? Well, Chris talks about these, medieval apprentices who, in his words, would kind of have sex with whoever was around. And so one thing I think about a contemporary politics of sexuality in an age of dawning precarity for more people than used to experience it would be a sexuality of circumstance. It takes a really long time to say, but a sexuality of circumstance as opposed to a sexuality of identity.